Now we're going to consider what happens to those lucky cases that actually get chosen for review. And first, let's take a quick look at the Supreme Court's calendar. By the Supreme Court's own rules, the term always begins each year on the first Monday in October. And so we are currently in the October 2019 term. The terms typically run until June. Usually the first or second week in June marks the formal end of the court's term. And during that time, between October and June, they hold their most visible public event, and that's known as oral argument. Oral argument is held on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays in alternating 2-week periods between October and June. So they'll have oral argument on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for 2 weeks, then they'll be off for 2 weeks, then they'll be back on for 2 weeks. Of course, the court has indefinitely suspended its proceedings during the coronavirus crisis, so we'll see if they actually hear any more cases this year. When they do hear cases, often there will be 2 sessions. There will always be a morning session, which begins at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That will usually run for 2 hours until noon. There will then be a lunch break, and often, but not always, there will be an afternoon session that begins at 1 o'clock, and that also runs for 2 hours until 3 in the afternoon. So if you're interested in going to the Supreme Court, it is open to the public. Oral argument is open to the public. It's the only part of what they do that is open to the public. And if you're just a regular member of the public, you can go in just by showing up and standing in line. Now, you should probably get there early, because as you can see from this picture, the line can get long, particularly on days that the court is hearing particularly significant cases. And on some days, seats may not be available to the general public at all. The attorneys, and they get some seats to give away. The justices get some seats to give away. Oftentimes there are VIPs there if it's an important case. And so some days there may not be any seats available to the general public, but most days there are. And if you decide to go to Washington, D.C., there are actually 2 lines you can stand in order to get into the court. There's a 3-minute line and an all-day line. In the 3-minute line, which moves much more quickly, they allow you into the courtroom. You never sit down, you just stand in the back, and you get to watch them for 3 minutes, although I have done it and it's actually a little bit longer than 3 minutes. The all-day line moves more slowly, but if you make it into the courtroom in the all-day line, then that means you actually get to take a seat and you get to continue watching oral argument until that day's break. All day is a bit of a misnomer because you only get to watch until the next break, but you do get to sit and stay for an extended period of time. Important thing, no cameras are permitted in the courtroom. Obviously, you'll go through a security check. They take all electronic devices, and they actually do a pretty good job. There's only 1 or 2 known photos of the court at oral argument. 1 brief video was posted online a few years back, but for the most part, there are no pictures and no video of the Supreme Court engaged in oral argument. Oral argument was originally unlimited, and it's kind of interesting because back in the old days, of course, we didn't have television, we didn't have radio, and so watching attorneys argue was actually one of the main sources of entertainment. And so when the court originally started, it was not at all unusual for attorneys to argue for days on end, and in fact, the longest oral argument that was ever presented to the Supreme Court lasted for 10 days, if you can believe it. 1 attorney talking for 10 days. Now in 1848, the court limited oral argument for the first time, but that limit was still pretty long, 8 hours per case, and that was divided equally between the sides, 4 hours per side. Nowadays, the court has shortened oral argument even more. The vast majority of all cases that they hear are now scheduled for 1 hour of oral argument. So each side only gets 30 minutes to make their case before the nation's highest court. Now, the court does make exceptions. They occasionally will schedule cases for more than 1 hour of argument, but those exceptions tend to be rare. But one example that we will read about in your book, The Oath, was the oral argument in Obamacare. That was a complex case, and they actually held oral arguments for 5 hours, and that one was spread out over 2 days. But that was the exception, of course, rather than the rule. One more thing to note is the quorum requirement. There are, of course, 9 members sitting on the Supreme Court, but absent justices are not replaced. Now that's very different from, say, the California Supreme Court. The California Supreme Court has 7 justices, and if one of the justices is absent, the Chief Justice has the power to appoint a lower court judge to replace them temporarily on that case. This U.S. Supreme Court has no comparable procedure, and therefore if a justice is absent for some reason, they're simply going to be not counted. So what happens if several justices either recuse themselves or are ill, or there's a vacancy on the court? Well, there need to be at least 6 justices available in order to hear a case. If there aren't, then the case simply can't be heard because the quorum isn't met. Now this is almost never an issue, but it was an issue back in 1988 when the Supreme Court accepted review in a case called Haig v. Bissonnette. And this involved a gentleman named Alexander Haig, and after the court had accepted the case for review, 4 of the justices dismissed themselves, and mostly because many of them actually had a personal relationship with Alexander Haig, and as a result, the court had to dismiss the case because it didn't have enough justices to hear it. So it was dismissed for a lack of a quorum. So on the day of oral argument itself, so let's say it's Monday, it's approaching 10 a.m. in the morning Eastern Time, the justices gather in a cloakroom next to the courtroom. This is where they're going to put on their judicial robes. And it's kind of neat. One of the things that they do while they're in the cloakroom is that they shake hands with each other. They shake hands as a show of solidarity. It's a tradition that's been going on for more than 100 years. But of course, interestingly, the coronavirus crisis has ended that tradition, at least temporarily. In their most recent conference, they did not shake hands, but traditionally they do. And then, of course, they put on their robes. And the question to ask is, why is it that justices wear robes? They look kind of silly, don't they? Well, the reason for robes is very important. If you'll recall, we said that one of the reasons that the Supreme Court does most of the things that it does is to portray a sense of legitimacy. They want you to believe that they are not politicians and that they are making their decisions based on the law rather than on their own personal preferences. And the robes are a symbol of that. The robes indicate that they are leaving behind their own personal backgrounds, their own personal beliefs, and they are becoming neutral scholars of the law. And so the robes are an indicator that when they put these robes on, they are transforming themselves into these scholars of the law who are behaving in a nonpartisan legal fashion, not a political fashion. Now it's kind of interesting because a few years ago when William Rehnquist was Chief Justice, he played around with the robe a little bit. So first of all, over here on the left, you can see this is Chief Justice John Roberts, and he is wearing the normal judicial robe. It looks a lot like the robe you'll wear when you graduate from San Jose State, and this is the way the robe has traditionally been. But when William Rehnquist was Chief Justice, one night he went to see an opera called The Pirates of Penzance, and he was taken by the costume that one of the characters wore, the Grand High Inquisitor, and so he went home and he redesigned his own robe. And so for the last few years that William Rehnquist was Chief Justice, his robe had these 4 gold bars on each side that you see pictured here. And that was the first time that it happened. And everybody was wondering when William Rehnquist passed away and John Roberts took over, would he keep the 4 bars on the robe or would he go back to the old robe? And as you can see from this picture, he went back to the old robe. So that was just sort of an affectation of William Rehnquist. So, as I've already indicated, the justices shake hands with each other. And then at 10 a.m. precisely, the Sergeant-at-Arms calls the court to order. So everybody in the courtroom is asked to stand, and the Sergeant-at-Arms yells out this: "Oyez, oyez, oyez. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court." And all of the members of the audience rise. The 9 justices file into the courtroom. They take their seat and they sit, and then the members of the court sit, and oral argument is about to begin. So, I guess I've already indicated all of this stuff. Something important to keep in mind, the bench on which the justices sit, of course, is in the front of the courtroom. It's a slightly curved bench, and the Chief Justice gets to sit in the center, and then the other justices sit around him in order of seniority. So the most senior justices, the ones who've been on the court the longest, sit nearer to the center, and the most junior justices sit nearer to the edges of the bench. And then the chief calls the first case. So this diagram is a bit dated in terms of the identity of the justices on the court, because of course Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy have left, but this gives a good view of what the court looks like, where the bench is. If you can see the sort of orange table, the yellowish table up near the front, that's where the attorneys sit. The justices, of course, sit in that red area, and then the audience members sit behind them. So that's a pretty good diagram that gives you an indication of what the courtroom looks like. So in our next lecture, of course, we will talk about what happens once 10 o'clock starts and the attorneys get an opportunity to make their cases.